The yard was silent, too silent. Then, all at once, the peace shattered. A warning siren echoed through the cold morning air of Pelican Bay State Prison. Guards shouted orders from the gun rail, rifles locked in place. Inmates hit the ground, hands over their heads. Others didn't move, they stood their ground, their eyes fixed on a group of men from another cell block. Within seconds, the yard erupted into chaos. Two rival groups clashed near the concrete wall, fists and makeshift weapons flying. The control tower's rifle cracked, a sharp sound that cut through the screams. When the dust settled, 5 men were on the ground, and this was just another day inside California's most feared Supermax. But what if I told you there was another prison, just 600 miles south, where the chaos was even worse? Where guards were accused of setting up fights between inmates for sport? That place was Corcoran, and for years, it battled Pelican Bay for the title of California's deadliest prison. Before these institutions became infamous across America, they were built with one goal in mind: control the uncontrollable. Both Pelican Bay and Corcoran were designed in the late 1980s and early 1990s to house the most dangerous inmates California had ever seen: gang leaders, lifers, and men who could start riots with a single word. Their walls weren't just built to keep people in, but to isolate them from power. Yet behind those walls, power didn't die. It adapted. Pelican Bay's Special Housing Unit, the SHU, was the heart of California's Supermax system. Prisoners here lived in near-total isolation, 8 by 10 concrete cells, no windows, no contact, no voices but their own echoing in the dark. They spent 22 to 23 hours a day alone, their only break being an hour in a small concrete dog run for exercise. It was meant to break down control, but instead, the SHU became the nerve center of some of the most organized criminal networks in the country. At Corcoran, things worked differently, but not better. Built in the flat, dry fields of California's Central Valley, Corcoran State Prison quickly gained a reputation for violence. Guards were overworked, prisoners overcrowded, and tempers always one argument away from boiling over. By the mid-1990s, reports began surfacing that officers were staging gladiator fights, placing rival gang members together in the yard and betting on who would walk away. State investigations and lawsuits followed, painting a picture of a prison system spinning out of control. One of the first men to speak out was a former guard named Richard Caruso. He described how fights were arranged in controlled yards, except nothing about them was controlled. "We knew what was going to happen," he said. "We'd open the doors and let them at each other. By the time officers fired warning shots, it was often too late." Corcoran recorded more shootings by correctional officers than any other prison in the United States during that decade. Meanwhile, in Pelican Bay, the chaos was quieter, psychological rather than physical. Inmates went years without touching another human being. Lights stayed on almost all day. Meals came through slots in steel doors. The isolation drove many to madness. Some banged on the walls just to hear another sound. Others began to write letters, hundreds of them, to courts, to lawyers, to anyone who might listen. Those letters would one day ignite one of the biggest prison reform lawsuits in California history, but beneath the silence, something powerful was happening. The gangs, the Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, Nuestra Familia, and Black Guerrilla Family, were thriving, even from solitary cells. They communicated through coded notes, shared signals, and invisible networks that stretched across the state. In one case, investigators discovered gang leaders ordering hits hundreds of miles away, all from inside the SHU. To the public, both Pelican Bay and Corcoran were names that sparked fear. To inmates, they were something worse, a sentence beyond prison. Men who had lived through both said the difference was in the kind of suffering you endured. At Pelican Bay, it was silence that broke you. At Corcoran, it was violence. Either way, survival wasn't about strength, it was about understanding the rules no one told you. By the early 2000s, stories began leaking to the press, stories of corruption, cover-ups, and rebellion. Some inmates spoke of guards who smuggled contraband for protection. Others described nights when the lights flickered off, and everyone in the tier knew something was about to happen. One former inmate said it best: "Pelican Bay starves your mind. Corcoran tests your soul." And then, in 2011, something happened that united both prisons in a way no one expected, an event that shook California's correctional system to its core. It started with a message passed from cell to cell, written in tiny letters on a strip of toilet paper. It would soon reach thousands of prisoners across the state, sparking the largest organized protest in California prison history. It was called the Hunger Strike of 2011, and it began inside Pelican Bay. The sound of trays being refused echoed through the halls, and within days, the entire state was watching. The morning count at Pelican Bay looked no different from any other, until officers began to notice something strange. Meal trays were being slid back out, untouched. By noon, dozens of cells had refused their food. By nightfall, it wasn't just dozens. It was hundreds. Inside the SHU, word had spread through the vents, the pipes, and the old prisoner network that never truly died. No food. No movement. No surrender, one inmate whispered through the air vent to his neighbor. The hunger strike had begun. What started as a single protest inside Pelican Bay's security housing unit spread like wildfire. Within days, more than 6,000 inmates across California had joined. They refused meals to demand an end to long-term solitary confinement. Some men had been locked away for over 20 years, never once seeing the open sky. The strike shocked the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR. They weren't dealing with a violent riot or escape attempt, they were facing silence. Controlled, coordinated, and deadly serious silence. Guards patrolled the tiers with unease, unsure what to do. A few muttered that it was only a matter of time before the hunger strikers gave in. But this time, they were wrong. Each passing day grew harder. Inmates weakened. Some collapsed in their cells. Medical staff moved through the blocks checking vital signs, but many prisoners refused care. "We'd rather die on our feet than live in a cage," one inmate wrote in a letter smuggled to the press. For the first time in decades, the world was looking inside Pelican Bay, not through the eyes of officials, but through the voices of the men trapped within. Newspapers began printing their testimonies. Television crews gathered outside the gates of Crescent City. Human rights lawyers called the conditions psychological torture. And in Sacramento, politicians who had long ignored prison issues were suddenly forced to answer questions, but not everyone saw it the same way. Some guards felt betrayed. "We risk our lives every day," one officer told reporters anonymously. "They talk about torture, but we're the ones they'd kill if the doors opened." Tensions inside the prison reached a boiling point. Every sound, every cough, every shout echoed like a threat. After 3 weeks without food, the hunger strike began taking a toll even the state couldn't ignore. Prison administrators ordered emergency meetings. Negotiators spoke through steel doors, urging inmates to eat. Some did. Many didn't. The leaders of the movement, men identified by the state as gang generals, refused. They claimed the SHU was being used not for punishment, but for control, to silence anyone with influence. The standoff grew into a moral and political war. Activists rallied outside the prison gates, holding signs that read, "End solitary now." Families of inmates drove for hours just to stand outside the razor wire fences, hoping their loved ones were still alive. Former prisoners came forward to tell their stories, some trembling, others angry. "You don't live in the SHU," one said. "You disappear." The hunger strike finally ended after nearly a month, but the impact was far from over. The protest had forced the state to admit that thousands of men were being held indefinitely in isolation, some for alleged gang ties based only on tattoos, drawings, or hearsay. The CDCR promised reforms. But inside Pelican Bay, the inmates weren't celebrating. They'd seen promises before. By 2013, a second, even larger strike began. 30,000 prisoners joined this time, stretching across nearly every major California facility. The movement's center of gravity remained inside Pelican Bay, but its reach proved something no one expected: isolation hadn't broken them. It had only made them more determined. The second strike caught the nation's attention. For the first time, people outside the prison system began to ask a simple question: what happens to a man when you lock him in a room alone for 20 years? And then, in 2015, something historic happened. After years of court battles, hunger strikes, and protests, the case Ashker versus Governor of California reached a settlement. The state agreed to end indefinite solitary confinement in its current form. Thousands of inmates were transferred out of the SHU, but even as the settlement was announced, the question lingered, had anything really changed? Back inside Pelican Bay, a few empty cells echoed with silence. Some men were released to general population, blinking against the sunlight like ghosts seeing daylight for the first time. Others remained behind, locked down under new labels, and far to the south, in another massive concrete fortress, Corcoran State Prison, administrators were quietly preparing for transfers. Some of the men from Pelican Bay's SHU were heading there, including gang leaders who had spent decades building invisible empires from isolation. Corcoran had its own dark history, one that involved scandals, blood, and whispers of corruption. Now, with Pelican Bay's power shifting south, California was bracing for a new chapter. The hunger strikes had shaken the system, but control was about to take a different form, because in Corcoran, the rules were the same, but the games were bloodier, and the moment those transfer buses arrived, history was destined to repeat itself, only this time, in a different yard. The prison was quieter now, but not at peace. Months after the hunger strikes ended, Pelican Bay was left with scars both visible and unseen. The walls, once echoing with the sound of banging trays and shouted chants, now carried only silence. Yet beneath that silence, something deeper was shifting. Officers walked their rounds, more cautious than before. They no longer underestimated the men in those cells. These inmates had starved themselves not for food, but for dignity. For years, California had treated solitary confinement as a permanent sentence within a sentence, but the hunger strikes had forced the world to look inside. The lawsuit that followed, Ashker versus Governor of California, brought long-buried truths to light. Court documents revealed that hundreds of inmates had spent over a decade in the SHU, some more than 20 years, without ever committing a fresh crime. Many were there not for violence, but for being validated as gang members based on tattoos, artwork, or the word of an informant. The court found that such indefinite isolation violated basic constitutional rights. Change came slowly. By 2015, California agreed to limit long-term solitary confinement and promised to move hundreds of men out of the SHU. Cameras captured the first moments as inmates stepped into daylight after decades underground, squinting, trembling, unsure how to react to open space. One man said softly, "I forgot the sky was this big." But not everyone believed freedom inside the system would last. Some correctional officers argued that moving gang leaders out of isolation was dangerous. They feared the very structure that made Pelican Bay infamous, the separation, had also kept the state from collapsing into chaos. Within months, reports surfaced of new tensions in general population yards. Former SHU inmates, now walking among others, carried reputations that made them both respected and feared. Some prisons experienced renewed gang coordination, others saw uneasy truces. California's Department of Corrections struggled to balance reform with control. Meanwhile, survivors of the hunger strikes began sharing their stories with journalists and advocacy groups. They described hallucinations from years of sensory deprivation, the madness that came with counting cracks in the concrete for comfort, and the haunting quiet that could drive a person to talk to their own shadow. Yet, for all its flaws, the movement achieved something that had once seemed impossible. Pelican Bay, the symbol of absolute control, had been forced to change. The inmates' act of resistance had transformed into a legal and moral reckoning for the entire state. On a gray morning, years later, one of the original strike organizers, now released, returned to the coast near Crescent City. The ocean roared in the distance, the same sound he could faintly hear from his cell but never see. He stood there for a long time, staring at the waves, free yet still haunted. He whispered, "We didn't win everything, but they heard us." That moment captured what Pelican Bay's story had always been about, not just violence or control, but the fight to be seen, to be human again, even behind the thickest walls. And as the camera fades to black, a final question remains for the audience. If a man can survive decades in total darkness just to make the world see what's been done to him, what does that say about the world that put him there?